In this video, I'll show you guys how to fill out contracts, right? Majority of you guys, are able to get leads, but you guys don't understand how to fill out a contract. And I'll walk you through all the different contracts. This one being a purchase and sale agreement, assignment of contract, a JV agreement. If you're doing a seller finance agreement contract, or a subject to contract. So we'll start with the easiest, the most basic one would be just a cash deal, right? Obviously, majority of the stuff is pretty self-explanatory. You're looking at this agreement is made. This, obviously you put the month, and then you put the date and the year, right? And between the seller and the buyer, whatever the seller's name is, and then the buyer, obviously your name, or your LLC. In this portion here, right, property address. All that's asking for is the property address. A lot of you guys are putting, APN numbers or legal descriptions, or whatever the case may be. Property address is literally the property address, right? Whatever the home is listed on Zillow, whatever address is on Zillow is the address you would put here. And then APN is the legal description. And that would, if you can't find the legal description, the best advice I could just say is just put, to be determined at closing, right? And then you obviously fix it up, make sure it looks clean and whatnot. And then typically I like to just highlight it so it flows perfectly. But yeah, to be determined at closing is another option you guys could use. If you guys can't find APN, typically if you go on batch leads, Deal Machine, PropStream, sometimes even PropWire, they provide the APN number, or sometimes even on Zillow and Redfin they provide it as well. So you're 9 times out of 10 it's best to put it on there. But if you can't find it, I would just leave it alone, and you could just put to be determined at closing. So the next step would be EMD, right? So EMD, considered earnest money. Typically, I want to say the range of 500 to 1,000. If you don't want any questions, just put 1,000. If you want to put in 500, that also works. Really doesn't matter. It's just based on the rapport that you build with the seller. If you think the seller is a bit wary of you, put in 1,000. If you're, your best buds with the seller, you could put in as low as maybe 500 to 100, right? It doesn't matter. Because you're not going to be paying this at the end of the day. Is paid by the end buyer. Cash due to seller at closing would just be, the total price, right, subtracted by the EMD, would be due to the seller at closing. So let's say, you owe the seller 1,500 at closing, or the total price would be 1,500. You submit 500 in EMD. Cash due to seller would be 1,000, right? Simple, straightforward. And this here, right, I would implore all you guys to take the time and really sit and understand and really read this and make sure you understand what every single clause in this contract means, right? Obviously, it's pretty straightforward and easy to begin with, but I always want you guys to look it over and make sure you understand, and kind of understand what you're even sending to the seller, right? Because majority of you guys don't even know what you guys are reading or what you're sending. You could, you know how to fill out these blanks, but you're not, if a seller asks you, hey, what does this mean? 9 times out of 10, you guys are stuck, right? Typically, I always like to advocate to you guys that, it's best to have sellers signed on the phone, right? That way, you're not working with delays or any of that case. Because sometimes if you send a contract over to the seller, 9 times out of 10, it's going to take about 2, 3, 4 days for them to actually look at it and sign it. And that could be eating away from you actually selling the deal, right? Or that could kill a deal, whatever the case may be, right? So you want to make sure first is obviously building good rapport, enough for them to trust you, and actually understand that you have their best interest at heart. And another thing is actually understanding what you're reading to them, right? Because 9 times out of 10, right, when I speak with sellers, I'm having them sign on the phone, right? I'm sitting on the phone with them. I'm explaining every single clause to them, right? What is earnest money? What is this? Excuse me, what is this, right? What is closing? What is, I'm saying every single thing I'm explaining to the seller. Some of them wondering why there's 13 days for an inspection. Explain to them, regardless if you're doing a home or a land contract, explain to them it takes time to get reports back, X, Y, and Z, whatever you have to say, right? And then condition, obviously, explain to them why this clause is in here. and then closing costs, right? That's pretty straightforward. And then this portion here, right? Additional terms and conditions. This is only if they are, certain things that isn't described in this agreement or in these clauses that needs to be added, saying that, seller is going to pay the remainder of the taxes or, whatever the case is, right? This would just go into here, right? Seller is paying their closing cost. Obviously, you could just edit it through here, but whatever the case is, right? You want to make sure it's added into here so it could be legally binding. Don't just take the seller's word for it. Make sure it's actually in the contract. And then obviously the rest of this is straightforward. You put in the date, seller's signature, and seller's name, and then vice versa. So you want to put the date, your signature, and your name, right? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It doesn't get as easier than this, right? And then so we'll move over to assignment of contract. This one is a little bit less complicated, but then again, it's just as simple as the purchase and sale agreement, right? This again, it breaks down the agreement, kind of just stating that this agreement is assignable X, Y, and Z, and it's based on the original purchase and sale agreement. But we'll walk through some of these things here, right? So this agreement is, and I want you guys to understand this, right? Because majority of you guys get this confused. A signer is the wholesaler, right? A signer is you guys. You guys are the assigner. A lot of you guys are putting the buyer here or the end buyer here when it shouldn't be that way, right? You guys are the assigner, right? So you want to make sure you're putting your name here and then you're putting the end buyer's name here. And then here goes the seller's name, right? Because again, the signer has entered an agreement to purchase real estate with the seller, right? Because again, you don't own the property, and you're assigning in the property or you're signing the contract over. And you want to put in, you want to put in the date, right? So you want to say this agreement was, the signer has entered an agreement to purchase real estate with, and in this case, actually, there's only one seller. In the event that there is another seller, you could put with and then you could put a little bit more blank if there's 2 sellers, 3 sellers, whatever the case may be. In this case, since there's only one seller, you just put one seller's name and then so on and so forth, right? And then a little bit further down, it says which is legally described as, right? All this means is property address. What is the property address? In this case, you put the property address here, and below it, again, you put the legal description, APN number, right here. So we'll scroll down. Again, I really advise you guys to understand and read these terms. It takes less than 10 minutes. And if you have any questions, like I said, you could always, message me or you could, ask ChatGPT, right? Both work really great. But for the most part, again, it's extremely simple, straightforward. You want to make sure you understand what you are sending, right? Majority of you guys are not understanding what's in these contracts, and it makes it a lot harder it makes it a lot harder for credibility if they ask, is this even your deal, X, Y, and Z? Do you know what you're doing? Whatever the case may be, you never want to seem like you don't know what you're doing, right? So make sure you understand and you read these contracts. So below here, right, would just be EMD, right? All this says is EMD, and typically for EMD, you want to get from buyers, and I want to say a minimum of 5,000, right? If they're a legit buyer, they have no problem submitting 5,000 EMD, right? If they want to submit less than, to be honest with you guys, if they want to submit less than $1,000 in EMD, I would definitely just move on, right? Because they're not a legit buyer, right? They're just there to waste your time. They're probably going to sign it over to another buyer. So if they can submit $5,000 in EMD, obviously the more the better, but typically $5,000 is the sweet spot to kind of weed out, people that are just looking to double close your deal or whatever the case may be, or sign it over to another buyer or whatever the case, right? So in this case here, EMD, I want to say is around $5,000. Any lower than that, you would want to make sure you vetted the buyer and it's, a reasonable buyer. Another rule of thumb is you want to make sure you'll always have enough margin in between seller EMD and your EMD, right? Reason being, if the buyer backs out, you can at least give some to the seller and at least walk away with a few grand. That way it's not a complete waste of your time. And below here, you'll just put your assignment fee, how much you're making on the deal. And this here is really, really important because, again, you want to make sure the buyer's okay with you making 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 grand, right? If they aren't, cut ties with them and go off to another buyer, right? Because they're just going to kill your deal once they see how much assignment fee you're making. So you want to make sure you're transparent as possible. I'm not saying you have to go on the phone and be like, hey, I'm making 20 grand on this. You want to buy this property. But you want to make sure, you letting them know, hey, look, I'm making a decent amount on this. The numbers work for you. You're satisfied with the number you're satisfied with number here. Are you affected by it? Does that matter if I'm making 20, 30 grand, whatever the case may be? And 9 times out of 10, if they're a serious buyer, they usually don't care. So we'll look at here again, you'll put your assignment fee at here as well. So both here and here. And then below here, you'll put purchase price and underlining transaction. So all this means, right, is where did you get the seller at? So if you got them at 50,000, you put 50,000 here, right? I think in the last example I said 1,500, right? So you put total purchase price from the seller is 1,500. Your assignment fee was what, 5,000, and then minus deposit. Deposits are only the EMD that the buyer submitted, right? So the minus deposit would be the EMD that buyer submitted, right? So in this case, if he submitted 5 grand in EMD, the minus deposit would be 5 grand. Okay, and then total due at closing by assignee would be pretty much what you assigned the buyer over to, or in simple terms, it would be pretty much total purchase price, right, minus the assignment fee, or excuse me, minus the deposit, right, or their EMD, whatever EMD you got them at. So if the total purchase price that the end buyer is buying it at is at 50,000, and they submitted 5 grand in EMD, total due at closing by assignee would be 45,000. Simple, right? So total due at closing is pretty much total purchase price minus the deposit, and that's what's owed to the title company at closing. And so this portion here pretty much states, when EMD, is going to be submitted, or excuse me, I'm sorry, when the deal will close, right? Typically, again, another rule of thumb, right? If the deal is, on the original purchase sale agreement, if you have closing on the 20th, I always advise you guys to do it 4, 5, 6 days before that, right? In case the buyer backs out, at least it gives you a little bit more time, to at least find a new buyer and try to save the deal. So typically a week before closing is always preferred, because again, you never know with some of these buyers, right? They like to back out last minute, and that way, if they do, you have a little bit of time to at least look for another buyer. So I would always want to put it, if it's closings on the 20th, I would put it at the at 15 or 13 or 12 or whatever the case, right? You always want to give yourself at least 5 to 6 days before the actual closing date with the seller. So it gives you time to look for another buyer in case it doesn't close. Again, like I said before, make sure you guys are reading these. Simple, straightforward, all it means is just, make sure you guys are understanding them for the most part, right? Because you never want to send something you don't understand. So we go down here, right? So all this states basically is, if they don't submit EMD within this designated date, this agreement will be null and void, and you're more than welcome to move over with another buyer. Typically, the rule of thumb, right, is that they have to submit EMD 24 hours prior to signing the agreement, right? So what that means is, if they sign the agreement today at 3 p.m., they have until tomorrow 3 p.m. To submit EMD. If they don't, then you move on to another buyer. I typically don't like giving out option periods, just because buyers tend to use that time to back out, or whatever the case may be. I always tell them, do your own due diligence, figure it out if it's the deal for you, and when it is, you will need EMD 24 hours, right? Because sometimes they just want to get your property tied up and waste your time, and then, you don't want to go through that, right? So let them know, hey, you let them know, hey, if it's not a deal for you, do your own due diligence, figure it out, and then if it makes sense, come by and we'll sign over the agreement, and we'll need EMD within 24 hours. So simple here as well. You just put the date. Again, here, a signer would be your name, and then signature, and then vice versa, and buyer's name and then signature. All right, simple, straightforward.